Thank you for inviting me. And when I started my graduate work more than 15 years ago, your film was one of the first entries that I had into the New York Intellectuals, and to be up here sharing a stage discussing the film is a real honor. So,
I'll just say that, as always, I'm incredibly grateful to Joe on a very personal basis, and I'm always very moved whenever I see the film and see my father, Daniel Bell, again talking. It's just a wonderful, wonderful thing you did. So thank you.
Now let's go through each person in the audience and try to say something nice about me.
All right, let's begin with the politics of this film. To my mind, the politics, though, is concerned with the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, is anything but ancient history. I think the politics are a living present in the time that we're living in now, and particularly one strand of the politics of these four men. And that strand is neoconservatism. People have predicted the death of neoconservatism, certainly since the first Iraq War. And it always seems to revive, it always seems to reemerge. I'd say the embodiment of neoconservatism today is Bill Kristol, Irving's son. The acorn does not fall far from the tree. And my question to the panelists is, how could it be that a group of Trotskyists, social democrats, socialists, liberals have given birth to this incredibly long-standing movement? I open that up.
I mean, I would say, I think we, clearly as the film shows, we have to distinguish. Irving Kristol became a proud, explicit neoconservative. The others didn't. Glazer came closer. My father was further away still. I think one thing which always have to remember is the crucial experience for these people of seeing what happened in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. I mean, 680,000 people executed in the Great Terror, tens of millions of people dead in the camps and in starvation. They saw what had happened to the ideals that, to a regime founded on the ideals that they themselves believed in. And so they had an enormous suspicion then of what could happen when people, simply pursued these ideals and pursued these ends with no regards to the means. So I think that in one sense, it became quite clear why some people would then go so far as to ally themselves with American conservatives against what they thought of as this threat.
Well, I'll say neoconservatism there I'm talking is a slippery term, one that has changed and has different iterations. And I think what neoconservatism means today is not what neoconservatism meant in 1968. I don't think it was even coined as a term till about 72 as a pejorative to describe liberals who shifted rightwards. And it was about domestic politics, not foreign affairs. So I think when we think about neoconservatism today, it's hard to find a trajectory back to the New York intellectuals broadly. I think you can trace a line to some extent to Kristol, but even with the foreign policy emphasis, he's not really tied to that emphasis later on. I mean, I think another important figure is Norman Podhoretz. And if anyone has remained connected to neoconservatism, it's Norman Podhoretz, his wife Midge Decter, and their son John Podhoretz. But I think for these figures, it's more complicated.
The only other thing I'd add to that is, initially, as we talk about in the film, it's a strain of questioning, a strain of questioning liberalism, which is very much a New York intellectual forte, this constant questioning of ideas, et cetera. Obviously, with Kristol, he himself, well, in his film, he says he was just still a neoconservative, but in other cases, he would describe at least his son and their generation as pure conservative. But it's interesting that so much is similar, and yet the interesting thing is, Bill Kristol is a massive never Trumper. And he even wrote something someplace sometime after Trump was elected he was bringing out his inner socialist roots, or I don't know what he said, and I almost dropped dead. I mean, so I don't think that's, on the whole, I think he's conservative, but it is interesting. I mean, I think it says something interesting about the line of the crystals, that there's still a questioning going on there. There isn't just pure tribal loyalty. I mean, I think you see that in Irving, even in the film, that it's not pure tribal loyalty, but there is a sense of how to play politics, but there is also something else going on there.
And yeah, one more thing. Is it on? Yeah, okay. I feel like I know less about Crystal's writings than some of the other figures, but it seems to me also that his conservative shift predates the late 1960s in some ways, and it's tied into something bigger, and that makes him unique too. And just to think about Trump, I think Norman Podhoretz is a pro-Trumper, and John Podhoretz is an anti-Trumper, right? I don't know much about that debate either, but that's something interesting to contemplate.
No, I think we can.
I think the never Trump phenomenon and its relationship to neoconservatism is a very interesting one. A lot of the neoconservatives are never Trumpers, but don't be deceived, they're still neoconservatives. I did want to give David a chance to clarify one point. One of the very first books written on the neoconservatives by Peter Steinfels was called, I think, The Neoconservatives, and it included Crystal, of course, and Glazer, naturally, but also his father, Daniel Bell. And I wanted to give you a chance to sort out what in your father might have been neoconservative, why he was identified as a neoconservative. And I saw you at one point shaking your head no when he was identified as a neoconservative. So here's your chance.
Well, I mean, I could go on for a very long time about this. I promise I won't. But he expressed it himself in the film. It was one of his favorite lines, where he said that he was a socialist in economics, a liberal in politics, and a conservative in culture. And he also often used to say that he had started off his life as a right-wing socialist, as a kind of Menshevik, and that's what he remained all his life, even as the world changed around him, but that he always remained in the same place. And I think there is actually something to be said for that. I think that there were two things, I think, about that led him to be identified as a neoconservative. He was always a very strong anti-communist, anti-Stalinist. He was increasingly wary about ambitious programs for social reform, particularly in the 1960s when he with Crystal founded the Public Interest. So this was one side of it. And then the other side of it was a revulsion for him against a great deal of 1960s culture, which comes out very clearly in one of the great books he wrote, which is called The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. What he saw in the 60s was a kind of lawless spirit. Antinomianism was one of the terms that he would use to describe it, sort of a kind of a rejection of the law, rejection of order. And he was very frightened by this. He had seen where this kind of wild political enthusiasm could lead in the 30s and 40s, and he didn't want to see this happening again. And he saw some of this in the SDS. He saw this in the passions at Columbia in the 1960s. So I think he was very wary about that. And The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism was written with a very strong critical line against what he called the hedonism of the 60s, the antinomianism of the 60s. And so that also led him to be associated as a neoconservative. But just as Ronnie Grinberg just said, there was this amazing shift, I mean, in neoconservatism between the relatively domestically oriented neoconservatism of the 1960s to the ferociously sort of foreign policy, Iraq war oriented neoconservatism of the later movement. Daniel Bell never was part of that shift. He was always quite liberal in his foreign policy. He was a critic of the Vietnam War from the start to the finish. Unlike somebody like Podhoretz, for example, who wrote a book called Why We Were Right and Why We Should Have Won in Vietnam. So I would say these are the reasons he was identified as a neoconservative. But again, there are very strong differences among these four people, and you can't lump them, certainly, but obviously but you can't lump the other three as neoconservatives.
I was just going to say a couple things. One is I think that if I'm not mistaken, I know Howe very much. I mean, I think we have a lot of people, 60s generation here, and I think there was a lot of rapprochement between Howe and the 60s people, and I think your father as well, because they were fighting essentially within the same family. I mean, Crystal left the family.
Yeah.
Bell never left the family. Glazer never left. Well, Glazer really, I don't know.
Glazer's ambiguous.
Yeah, he's ambiguous.
Glazer's more
Although
ambiguous,
he's
yes.
much more, he's about as dovish as you get. He was certainly never a foreign policy neoconservative. But the only other thing I'll say is, I mean, I think when I started doing this film, and I didn't grow up in a political household at all, and I became steadily more interested in politics, never an activist. But as I got to know these men, I had already become interested, obviously reading them. But you know, they influenced my own politics and my own questioning at that point of some of the liberal social reform. I still counted myself as a liberal, but most of my friends started, you know, criticizing me because there's a certain point where if you're a Bell or a Glazer, the subtlety of your ideas don't fit into, they were not political warriors in the way either Howe or Crystal were. So it's very easy, I think, to get mislabeled. I don't, if you agree.
Yeah, no, I agree with that entirely. And there was a rapprochement, I think, between my father and a lot of the 60s radicals, really in the last decade of his life, in the first decade of this century, when he would start to talk to a lot of them again about socialist ideas and found a great deal of common ground.
Well, I was just going to say, I think I know Nathan Glazer in 2005 was quoted as saying, you know, how neoconservatism morphed from this term that dealt with domestic politics to one that deals entirely with foreign policy. He found very surprising. And the other thing I would say is, I think in the 1990s, someone like Midge Decter said there are no neocons, sort of suggesting that the neocons had been fully embraced into kind of the family values conservatism of the Republican Party. And I think that's an important part of the story as well, is that many of them who are most associated with did embrace capital C conservatism in a lot of ways.
I want to move on to these men's anti-Stalinism. And certainly in the case of Bell and Glazer, Howe on one side, Crystal on the other are a little different, but certainly in the case of Bell and Glazer, they would view themselves as Cold War liberals. A man who wrote one of the first memoirs of the New York intellectuals, William Barrett, who was an editor there in the 40s, said, what attracted him to this group was not that they were anti-Stalinist, but they were anti-Stalinists of the left. And this, it turns out, was very important, but also a very almost fine line to walk. I know with some of my younger colleagues at the Book Review and at the Times, if you say that someone was fervently anti-communist, they associate them with McCarthy or with the right wing or with Richard Nixon. And I think one of the most moving or at least intriguing parts of Joe's film is when these men are trying to struggle with the McCarthy problem. And I want to ask the panel, do you think they succeeded? Glazer at the end says, no, they never really worked out their position. But what would a Cold War liberal's position on McCarthy look like?
Well, I mean, I find Glazer's position to be really convincing and remarkable, that it was very difficult to find the right line. Daniel Bell says, you know, they had the right, communists, to give their political opinions, but they didn't. But the part that's not mentioned, or he doesn't mention, is that the Supreme Court didn't uphold the right of communists to their First Amendment rights of freedom of association and freedom of expression. And so they would, the ability to rely on the First Amendment was lost, I think, with the Hollywood 10. And so then relying on the Fifth was what they needed to do. I'm totally removed from this, from this generation. But so I watching the film again, I was really struck by Glazer's position, that it was just very difficult.
Well, I mean, I think my father would have said, you know, they should have not taken either amendment. They should have said proudly, I'm communist, and gone to jail, if that's what they stood for. That was his point of view, I think.
Didn't that strike you when he said that as a little callous, a little overdone, maybe? I don't mean to attack.
No. I mean, I understand where it comes from. I understand. No, I mean, I wouldn't agree with it myself. I studied with a wonderful historian, Natalie Davis, whose husband actually went to prison for taking the First Amendment in the 1950s. I don't think it was the right attitude to take at the time, but I do understand why they came to it, because again, for them, they saw the immense evil of Stalinism, and they were ready were they ready to cut some corners in order to defeat it? Yes, and too many. Yes, and with hindsight, too many. But we shouldn't forget that it was really an immense evil as well.
Yeah. You know, I have two things to say. One is going into that period, submerging myself in that particular period, it truly is a swamp. And I talked to people on the right and left. I interviewed, I don't know, 5 or 6 or 7 different members of the Communist Party, some from City College, some not, who never appeared in the film. It took us the longest period of time to try to get that part of the film correct. And the man who edited the film, Jonathan Oppenheim, who happens to be the son of Judy Holliday, who was also up in front of one of the committees. We almost came to blows at times over that, which was not always a good thing, but in some ways was a good thing. But I found that no one came out of that period morally pure. It was so difficult. It was such a swamp. It was almost impossible, I think, to find a position because you were overwhelmed by McCarthy and the politicians. So trying to have a clean argument or trying to figure out the exact spot to be that would leave you morally pure or in the right spot was impossible. I don't think, I would say that almost no one could find it and no one did it. And that includes the historians often of the period as well. The other thing I just want to say, I don't know if in defense of Dan or not, but one of the most, and I think I told you this, one of the most powerful moments for making the film for me was actually at the last interview I did with Daniel Bell. We got to the point where we were getting to the McCarthy period, and I had gone in with the instructions from my editor to really push him, because I had been, I asked all the questions the first time around, but there was a little tentativeness, right? And I was very nervous. And we finished a tape, and I knew that I had to launch into the 50s in the McCarthy period. And I went to the bathroom and I looked at myself in the mirror and I thought, is this the end of the film? Because I was worried if I pushed him too hard, he was going to throw me out of the house, And so I asked him a question. I didn't like the answer. I kept pushing. And instead of, in fact, attacking me, he just broke open in this very generous way and defended his position. And he was arguing, and he was arguing in a way that wasn't angry or nasty. He was defending himself as if he were back there. And so, although I think that Glazer's probably right, none of them got the right position. I don't know if anyone could, in fact. It's really remarkable in a lot of ways how he remained fluid and open at that moment, even if he couldn't get to where Glazer did, maybe.
I agree.
I want to mention just one example of the swamp. One of the editors of commentary, a New York intellectual who died young and may not be familiar with a lot of people here, is Robert Warshaw. Warshaw wrote 2 magnificent essays. He was one of the few New York intellectuals who was really concerned with popular culture. And he wrote about comic books and the like. But he wrote 2 magnificent essays on movies, one on gangster movies, one on the Western. But he also wrote an essay about the Rosenbergs. And he looked at the Rosenbergs' letters, correspondence to each other in prison. Here are these 2 people who are going to be executed, and Warshaw took a scalpel to it and talked about how Philistine they were and how inauthentic. And there was something heartless in that essay. And I have great regard for Warsaw, but there was something just cruel in his anti-communism, in his anti-Stalinism. Let me move on. I began by talking about the legacy that found a strand in neoconservatism. I now want to talk about the socialism legacy. We have someone who could, a self-avowed socialist, who could very well be the Democratic nominee for the presidency this year. And I want to ask the panel, is that the legacy of Irving Howe and of Irving Howe's socialism?
Well, I asked, I'm writing a chapter right now on Irving Howe, and so I'm interviewing people who knew him. And I had an interview yesterday where I asked almost that exact question. And the woman I was speaking to said that no, because Bernie Sanders comes out of a sectarian sort of inability to compromise, which wasn't what Irving was about at all. And that I asked also in the night when, and she said, you know, when Bernie Sanders was rising up in his political career in Vermont, he was an independent. He would not work with Democrats. And for Irving Howe, that's not what he was about at that period. So that's, I don't have a full answer. I'm sort of exploring these things, but that's what someone who knew and worked with him at Dissent told me yesterday.
I mean, I'd probably agree with that. I mean, true, I think Larry David could actually play an excellent Irving Howe. And, you know, certainly the accent, you know, the white hair going everywhere, that's all, you know, classic New York intellectual. But Sanders does come from a different generation. I mean, he really does, he may be, you know, nearing 100, but he's still, you know, he's from a different generation. He did not grow up. I mean, one thing that these people did in the 30s is, you know, they had these intense discussions of Marxism where they would sit and they would read Capital together, and they would read the manifesto together, and they would read the German ideology together, and they would argue about it. Sanders comes of age in a period when people weren't doing this in the same way anymore. He wasn't coming out of this sort of intense socialist groups. He didn't come out of a socialist party in the way that actually people did when Norman Thomas was still getting millions of votes running for president. So, and Sanders is much more influenced by the 60s and comes to socialism. I think actually is a fairly late, you know, description of self-description for himself. He was always a radical. I'm not sure when he starts to really call himself a socialist. I don't think in the 60s he really called himself a socialist. So I think, you know, he's coming now towards a lot of these ideas, but I don't think it's not the same background though.
Yeah, you know, the only thing I would say is that one of the things that struck me, one of the things that Crystal says in the film is when he talks about the Republicans, and he says it's not necessarily the Republicans know what to do, it's they know what not to do, essentially, because they're not defensive about the reforms, liberal reforms. It feels to me, anyway, that we're in an almost polar moment here, where we've now had 35, whatever it is, years of Republican policy, whether you call that reform or whatever you want to call it. And so it feels to me, and at the moment that I was making the film, Irving Howe was truly in the wilderness. Now we're at a moment where it feels the left is much more open. We're at a very different moment in terms of the country being open to the idea of someone who calls himself a socialist. It's so different from the moment when I made the film. So whether or not he's actually an Irving Howe socialist, he does come out of the DSA, which Howe created. So that's fascinating. I mean, when I made this film, I mean, it really seemed like, you know, we were watching the last socialist die before our eyes, and we were in a lot of ways. So it's in that way, it's shocking.
I just wanted to say one other thing, which I think does actually bring Sanders closer to these people, which is that Irving Howe and the socialists of the 1930s were universalists. They really, you know, believed in, you know, everybody being the same, everybody being able to talk about anything. One thing which certainly would have united the four of them until the end, Howe included, was a kind of distaste for identity politics. And Sanders certainly shares that. He mutes it because he has to, because of the kind of campaign he's running. But if you saw the remarks he made immediately out of the 2016 election, where he said the Democratic Party has gone too far towards identity politics, we have to retreat from that. The fact that, you know, just the controversy in the last week about the endorsement from Joe Rogan, which he has not disavowed. Clearly, Sanders also, you know, is very uneasy in a kind of, with identity politics, and I think that does bring him closer to these older socialists.
I want to press this point a little further. I wonder really what the legacy of Irving Howe's variety of socialism is in the present day. How would he, if we saw in the film that there was a really kind of great hostility among these four to the new left and the younger generation, our generation, not yours, but the three of us. And now we're dealing with even younger self-proclaimed socialists. What would Irving Howe think of someone like AOC?
I have no idea. I think you would find her charming, like almost everyone does, with some exceptions. But I do think, the one thing is, and I think Walzer says this in the film, one of the aspects of being in a movement is finding the next generation and then the generation after that. So I think that to the degree that this goes on and there is someone like AOC, it's because how, after the 60s ended up sitting in a room with Todd Gitlin and with other people who then sat in a room with their students, even though they may not have agreed, et cetera. So you see this passing of the torch from one generation to the next, this belief that if the only way for an idea to live is to find a son or a daughter, not necessarily blood related, who will pass on that idea. And I think these guys, all four, well, maybe not Glazer's, maybe the exception of this, because he wasn't thinking of legacy in that way, but certainly the others, I think, really did see the importance of finding those generations. And so that allows those links, I think, to take place that gets to someone like AOC, who probably has no idea who the hell Irving Howe is.
Well, that's what I was wondering. I mean, is there any link then? I'm not sure we can say any more about this, but that's precisely the point. If someone asks AOC, what do you think of Irving Howe? She is a member of DSA, and so she would have a consciousness of the name, but would she have a consciousness of the man or the ideas that he struggled with?
There's new journals, Jacobin, that I think have modeled themselves on dissent. I think they would be they're more sectarian than Irving Howe would have. I think he would have had the same issues that he had with 1960s radicals. Perhaps if he were around, he would have more wisdom in how he approached it. And the other thing that the person who I talked to yesterday, who comes out of DSA, sort of saying she has no place in this organization anymore, also because of BDS and the role that it's taken. And that, I think, is something that would have alienated these intellectuals, towards the later part of their lives.
Yeah. No, I'd agree with that, and I would actually, if you actually read Dissent magazine today, it's I urge everybody to read it. It's edited by my first cousin Michael Kazin, but you see in Dissent that there's actually a split in Dissent today, very clear, because on the one hand there's the editor Michael Kazin, the former editor Michael Walzer, who are very close to Howe's trajectory, and who Michael Kazin's ideal Democratic candidate was Sherrod Brown from Ohio. He probably would support Warren now. And then there's a part of the younger dissentniks, as we can still call them that, who would support, who would be supporting Bernie, and who are much closer to the Jacobin crowd. So the struggle is actually going on in the pages of the magazine still.
I just want to add one more personal note here. Ronnie told me about the woman that she was speaking to yesterday, and I will just mention to all of you that the first time I saw Arguing the World, I saw it with her, and when the death of Irving Howe came on, she was in tears watching the film. I want to shift to another large subject, which is Jewish identity. I think of someone like Philip Roth, who, as we know, was really reluctant to identify himself as a Jewish novelist. He thought that pigeonholed him. He thought his aspirations were much larger than that. And yet, clearly he is a Jewish novelist. And I want to ask about these men on the screen. Are these men Jewish intellectuals? Are they intellectuals who are Jewish? Is that a distinction without a difference? What is their Jewish identity?
I'll go first. You know, it's funny. When I went into making this film, the idea behind making the film had to do, I was interested in their anti-Stalinism, their anti-communism. I had no idea I was making a Jewish film until I was told it wasn't Jewish enough. And then I realized I got to, one of the major complaints was I didn't have any of the men reacting to the Holocaust. And I think that actually I went into the film with the same blind spot in many ways these men did. And this was talked about on the panel earlier. It's what kind of Jew you perceive yourself to be, whether you come out of a religious tradition or whether you come out of a totally secular tradition. Someone like Vivian Gornick earlier today, you know, has no interest in that, in the religious side of things. She sees herself as a secular Jewish intellectual, whereas obviously someone like your dad, really, and Irving Howe and Nathan Glazer and Irving Kristol, all of them, despite, you know, when Glazer says, I had no interest where I was coming from, I wanted to know where I was going to. But over the course of their lives, they all did end up more and more accepting and being able to incorporate their Jewishness into their work. And some more explicitly than others, but I think whereas in the 40s and 50s, there's clearly a move away from that, a desire even for those people at Commentary, for Commentary to be kind of the non-Jewish Jewish magazine, despite that, you know, there are, you know, rabbis being published or whatever. I think there's, you know, increasingly an ability to incorporate that aspect of themselves. I remember someone said to me about Howe somewhere that who was the most militantly atheist, I think. I mean, he was truly militantly atheist, and they almost plotzed when they saw him going in a synagogue on the High Holy Days at one point. So, you know, he, despite his work, you know, working in the field of Yiddish and stuff, even he somehow had some kind of rapprochement with some religious roots he had.
I mean, of course, they were Jewish intellectuals, right? I mean, but of course, they all had this very complex and difficult relationship to Judaism and I mean, in different ways. I mean, for my father certainly. I mean, and my mother as well. I mean, these are people who are born to immigrants from Eastern Europe. You know, their first language is Yiddish. They grow up in the slums of New York City, in the Yiddish-speaking slums of New York City, and then they're able to get out. And they're able to get out thanks to public education, and particularly CCNY or Brooklyn College for my mother. And as they get out, of course, when they look back to the Lower East Side or to Brooklyn, they're not looking back with fondness, they're not looking back with nostalgia, they're actually looking back to a certain extent, and it's very understandable, but they're looking back with a certain degree of shame, with a certain degree of embarrassment. When my mother, who went to study at Harvard in the 1940s, went there, she found that nobody would talk to her because of her accent, and she took elocution classes to lose her Brooklyn accent. And you know, they didn't think of the Yiddish language as something, you know, that should be treasured in some ways, and they were always embarrassed somewhat by their parents who had very little education, who were superstitious, who, you know, had the culture of Eastern Europe. It took them a long time to get past that and to understand what they had lost, in a sense, and the world that they had come from.
I would just add also that, yeah, they came out of these immigrant groups and were looking to move beyond them. And then many of them were involved in the socialist and Marxist movements of the era, which elevated class and universality over ethnic identity. That was part of it. But like David said, I mean, Jewishness was always there. And, you know, Irving Howe has this beautiful essay in 1968 where he coins the term New York intellectuals. I think people had written a little bit about them before, but he coins that term. And he talks about how no matter how much they tried to escape it, it hung to their speech, to the way that they looked, to their, you know, to their nose, all these sorts of things. And I was talking beforehand, and you know, I live in Oklahoma. There's a couple Jews in Oklahoma. I'm one of them. But one of the things you don't really, I think and hearing the people talk earlier about City College is that it was Jewish. Jewishness was everywhere, that you could take it for granted in some ways, but that doesn't mean it didn't exist, it didn't shape you. I see now in Oklahoma where that's totally absent. And in fact, it's Christianness that's taken so as the norm. So when I was listening to people sort of talk about City College, I think, it is sort of this, not privilege might not be the right word, but when you're just surrounded with Jews, you don't realize how much Jewishness is shaping things. And I realize now in Oklahoma how much Jewishness is lacking, and I'm happy to be back here. Though I like to say it's not that bad.
I think the earlier panel today was talking a lot about their Jewishness and the valences and stuff. But, one of the funny things is only a 16-year-old Jewish kid from New York would think they were blending into America by becoming an anti-Stalinist Trotskyist. That they were somehow shedding their particularity. So I think that sort of says it all.
Ronnie, you've written, I think, very insightfully about the Jewish male aspect of the New York intellectuals. And I'd like you to share your views on that with the group.
Well, I was invited, I think, to participate in this panel for a number of reasons, but I have an article about CCNY in the 1930s, and one of the things that struck me about the New York intellectuals was the overwhelming maleness. There are women, and we'll probably get to that in a minute, but they are an exception in a lot of ways. And that they were functioning in these Jewish male spaces. And so what did Jewish masculinity mean to them? How did that form? And thinking about the 1930s from the 1950s, that's a period of tremendous change for American Jews, from going from outsiders in all sorts of ways, racially, politically, religiously, to sort of being integrated as insiders. So when I was looking back at City College in the 1930s, I was struck with how combative debate, arguing, it's a central Jewish trait, and women can definitely embody it too, but there's something particularly masculine at City College about it. I mean, it's a university that's filled with men. I mean, you can see it in the film clips, some of the clips you found. All those Jewish sons in one space, arguing, debating. And so I talked about how Jewish masculinity for these figures comes to embody that, to mean that argumentative debate. And that's not the only model of Jewish masculinity. I mean, the ROTC, as we heard this morning, was present. Jews become athletes. It's not the only one, but for these intellectuals, I think that becomes a way that they express a sort of a masculinity.
Well, there's a basic sort of Jewish male space, which certainly my father was exposed to very early in life, which is the cheder. And people go there and they read Talmud and they argue and they argue and they argue. And it is an all male space, and this becomes in a sense translated into a different register when they moved on to CCNY. But I think there's something in the Jewish, in Jewish culture, which certainly drove that. And I think also, another thing is that, of course, growing up in the 30s, this was still a country with a great deal of anti-Semitism in the 1930s. They felt that they had to defend themselves. My father talked often about the gangs sort of roaming around on the Lower East Side when he was a kid, and you would be fighting the Ukrainians, you'd be fighting the Italians, you'd be fighting the Portuguese, whatever, the Irish. So there's this kind of combativeness which is also bred in, from the beginning. After the Holocaust, it then takes on yet another meaning, as you feel that you need to be tough and defend yourself against the world, and you have, with somebody like Norman Mailer, the kind of image of a tough Jew, which certainly became very important for somebody like Beit-Horitz.
Yeah, and just thinking off that, when you read journalistic accounts of this group, or from the time, a lot of times they refer to the types of debate as Talmudic, but it's secularized, and that comes up over and over again from Todd Gitlin, I think, to Tom Hayden, to Jack Newfield, to them themselves describing it. So they saw a link, I think, to this Jewish masculine rabbinic ideal, but it was sort of secularized for them in the United States.
Let me pose this a little provocatively.
No, go ahead.
The four of them begin as Marxists, as secular. They are four men of enormous accomplishment, but they do not identify as Jewish intellectuals, in those early years when they're developing and when they are beginning to achieve. The identification with Judaism, in the case of someone like Irving Howe, World of Our Fathers and the like, comes later. Could they have achieved what they had achieved if they had started out with an identification as Jewish intellectuals?
I'll just say one thing. Eliot Cohen, who was the editor of Commentary before Norman Podhoretz from 1945 until 1959, apparently joked that, Commentary was openly Jewish. Partisan Review was the one that, it was Jewish, but no one would admit it. I can't remember the exact quote, but I think they were aware of their Jewishness, and at least in the Commentary crowd, even earlier, were beginning to embrace it a little bit more.
I mean, one thing is interesting. Just think of the names: Howe, Bell. Crystal is more obviously Jewish. Glaser still, but none of them are what people in the 30s would have described as aggressively Eastern European. My father was born Daniel Belatsky. When he was 13, the family changed the name. If he had continued to be named Daniel Belatsky, I very much doubt he ever would have been hired by Columbia University.
And Howe
Good
was
point.
Irving Horenstein. He chose
Exactly.
his party
Precisely.
name. Right.
Right, precisely. Yeah.
Yeah. I have absolutely nothing to say about that that hasn't already been said.
Are we going to talk about politics or not? We don't have to.
Well, I was going to move on to the women who were part of it, which again is very much your subject. We can talk about the alcoves, but let's talk about the women first. We see Diana Trilling talking here about how this was very much a men's club, and I think it's important. And while that's true, I think it's important not to impose our own present views on a period when everything was a men's club. And I'd like Ronnie to say a few words about the women who were part of the New York intellectual crowd, and then I want to engage her a little bit.
Okay. Well, I think women could be part of the crowd, but it was harder. And many of them became part of being the crowd. This doesn't take away from their brilliance or their intellect, but being romantically involved with someone in the crowd. And, Diana Trilling talks about how they always wanted to talk with the men. They weren't interested in the women. I have a quote from Jason Epstein, who becomes the founder of the New York Review of Books, where he says, with women in that crowd, the first thing you thought about was whether they were good looking and if you could sleep with them. But if a woman could write like a man, that was enough. You wanted a piece of writing. You'd forget everything for a good piece. So you can see, and David and I have talked a little bit about his mother, and I won't say too much. I'll let him talk about her. But thinking a little bit about, they didn't want to be seen as writing as women. Like, an insult in some ways was being called a lady critic, which they did over and over again to dismiss these women, I think, sometimes. Or sometimes, there's a famous debate at Town Hall with Norman Mailer and a bunch of feminists where he introduces Diana Trilling as a lady critic. And it's supposed to be a compliment, but it has this this tone of sort of dismissiveness. But what's the opposite? So I argue to some extent that writing for them meant to write like a man, like Jason Epstein said. So for some of them, they had to perform a combativeness that was even more severe to the men to be able to sort of stay part of this crowd. And what's super interesting about all of them is that they were ambivalent to feminism, aside from Diana Trilling, really, and your mother actually had some. But they weren't particularly thrilled with second wave feminism when it came out. So there's really interesting questions. I think partly because they competed in this world, they were able to do it, that they made it, and so they didn't see the problem with it, yet they still faced what we would call sexism today in their own lives, and were frustrated kind of with the way that they were treated at cocktail parties or in their marriages. There's a lot of divorces in this group, tremendous amount. It's hard to conjecture on personal relationships, and I don't know how fair that is, but it seems to me it must have been hard to be married to a lot of these men.
My experience about intellectuals is that everyone is sleeping with everyone else. So, did you want to say something?
I'm not sure. I think this is obviously gets very personal for me. My mother, Pearl Kazan Bell, was the sister of the critic Alfred Kazan. She was a wonderful critic in her own right. That said, my parents had, when it came to the domestic division of labor, their marriage was very traditional, which is to say my mother did everything in the house. And that taking care of my father could occasionally be a full-time occupation. So that so it didn't always leave her as much time as she needed for her own work and her own writing.
Just to follow up with sort of what both of you are saying, there's no question that this group was brutal, period, in terms of one another and their combativeness, and particularly brutal toward women, as you pointed out, Ronnie. But it's interesting because the other thing you say, and I think this is true, and I think this is a part of Jewish culture, is that on the one hand, it's deeply patriarchal, and there's men and then there's the women. But there, I always think about, my father was an analyst, psychoanalyst, and I think about the psychoanalytic group, Freud's group, and this group that, on the one hand, deep sense of, the patriarchy. On the other hand, if you could make it, you were accepted. And that was, I think, different, certainly, than most other, I guess Bloomsbury also had a number of women, if you talk about an artistic intellectual group. But within America, I think it was unusual to have even that amount of acceptance of women, even if it came at an enormously high price, as both of you point out.
I think that's absolutely true. I think on the other hand, they still often played second to their husbands.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Diana Trilling, very well respected, but second to Lionel Trilling. I write about Midge Decter, who's Norman Podhoretz's wife, who almost no one has written about. And she was prolific on social conservatism. And she's sort of been overshadowed, I think. Not that I don't sympathize with her politics, but thinking about her contribution. So that's one thing I would say, which is interesting to think about. The other,
She was also a very important editor. She edited two of my father's books.
right, and I support an editor. And almost no one knows, of a certain, she just doesn't. She's barely mentioned in scholarly literature. I'll put it at that. People I think in this audience might know who she is. And the other thing is there's been a couple of books and online forums in recent years sort of talking about the invisible writing labor that some of these women did on their husbands' manuscripts. So there's a Susan Sontag book that just came out, which, I think, and this might have been out there beforehand, but that she basically wrote most of the Freud book, Philip Reef. There have been some debates about Richard Hofstadter's wife. I don't have any way to prove whether this is true or not, but these are things that people have talked about. And Diana has talked about how she was infuriated after Lionel passed away to go through his manuscripts and see that the edits that she did on his work that helped him weren't kept in the archive.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you totally. It's interesting. The other side of it is, if you were, for the two women who probably really were, made it on their own. One came from outside the group, that's Hannah Arendt, and the other, Mary McCarthy. And in that case, as Crystal says in the film, the men were actively frightened of these women. They felt so, I think this is, I don't want to take away the other side, but I think that it's the other side of the male, the male putting women down, is that when they are particularly strong, there's a male, fear of the male ego there that.
Mary McCarthy, they were constantly dismissive of Mary McCarthy, even though she might have been the most successful, but constantly dismissive that she was sort of a lady novelist, didn't deal with serious issues. And Hannah Arendt was known as Hannah Arrogant. I've heard from other people, Lionel Abel behind her back to some extent.
But is that worse than what they were saying about
one
another?
Well, it might not be worse, but I think when Eichmann in Jerusalem came out in 1963, there's a book that was written in 96 by a political scientist, that she makes an argument that gender had something to do with the reception that Hannah Arendt felt. Because some of the arguments that she was making, especially about the Judenrat and even some of the other stuff, had been made by Raoul Hilbert, help me.
Raoul Hilbert.
Yes, and they didn't get the same type of pushback. So I think you're right that Hannah Arendt was totally revered in the group, and she came from Europe in the 1940s. Later, she was married to someone not in the group. But there were still these, it's almost like you couldn't win as a woman. You were either too tough or you weren't tough enough.
Right. Yeah.
And Hannah Arendt could be quite misogynistic herself.
Right.
The way she treated other women in the group and telling them, shush, little girl, you don't know what you're talking about.
Right.
That's true. I do think this is a case of, and I think we see it in the differing perspectives, somewhat differing, Ronnie and Joe. The glass is half full, half empty, and I'm a half full guy on this one, which is to say, Hannah Arendt, Mary McCarthy, Diana Trilling, Elizabeth Hardwick, a little later, Susan Sontag, Pearl Bell, B. Himmelfarb. I know I'm leaving out one or two. This is like the 1927 Yankees or the 1985 Chicago Bears. I mean, this group of women, whatever obstacles were placed in their way, this was an extraordinary group of women. And I wonder if they serve as a model for younger women today, or whether they're receding into the history. No one knows. Okay. Let's move on. One other thing, which is talk about the group, the New York intellectuals. And one of the intriguing things here is Partisan Review, which was the Bible for this group. But then, as you saw in the film, they were constantly starting magazines. And so there were a number of other magazines. Partisan Review, I think, at its height, had something like 5,000 or 8,000 subscribers. Public Interest, which really became the fount of neoconservatism, had something like 15,000 or 20,000. Of course, Irving Kristol says with 300 readers, you can change the world, but let's leave that as hyperbole. Commentary had a somewhat larger circulation, but not significantly larger. I mean, think of the mass circulation magazines like Time and Newsweek and Life and Look. And here are these magazines with just a couple thousand subscribers. How did they do it? How did they become the iconic New York intellectuals that we now are talking about?
I mean, one very basic way they do it is by publishing things that then get talked about in your periodical, in the New York Times, which has a few more subscribers than that. And I think that a lot of these ideas were among these readers, even if they were just a few thousand readers, among those readers were the editors of the New York Times, the New York Herald Tribune, PM, Time, Newsweek, Fortune. And so these ideas would have an influence on these much larger organs and percolate, I think, into the larger discussion in part that way.
Yeah, and there was, I think we all agree, there was much less competition from all the other forms of media. You know, Irving Kristol talks about, you know, once they couldn't get into the New Yorker originally, even the New Yorker, then they got into the New Yorker. But I mean, it's interesting the difference in generations between Irving Kristol and Bill Kristol. Irving Kristol hated to be on TV. Bill Kristol, it is his medium. And you know, however you want to view that. But so I think that you, with less competition, perhaps you were able to have a lot of impact. Also, of course, they had the CIA behind them in the 60s. I don't know.
Not all of them. I don't think Partisan took CIA
Yes,
money.
Partisan did.
They?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
I take that back. We're getting signals from Judy. Where are we? Do we have time for questions? Do we have time for one more point for me to make to the panel?
I think we're going to have to skip questions, so you do one more point, and then I'm afraid we have to end. But
Sorry, guys. We're Jewish. We talk a lot.
We used to joke that that the competitive sport in my house was competitive talking.
This in a way is a large question, and I'm not sure I can formulate it properly. When we saw the division between these New York intellectuals, and really all of them, and the younger generation, it was profound, and it was translated here politically, and that was certainly a key part of it. But on the two main issues that the new left and the younger generation made their own, the war in Vietnam and civil rights, it's not as if, I think even Irving Kristol, but certainly the other three, it's not as if they were opposed to the positions that the younger generation took. There was something else going on. And what I want to suggest to the panel is that that something else was as much cultural as political. In that touchstone essay by Irving Howe, The New York Intellectuals, he's very dismissive of the Beatles. And it's hard to imagine what they would have made of Bob Dylan. Or we know that the New York Intellectuals championed the abstract expressionists, and then Andy Warhol came along and utterly wiped out, well, that's overstating it, but changed the direction from abstract expressionism. Movies are another interesting example. Pauline Kael, Andrew Sarris, who are they championing? Not, they like Ingmar Bergman, they like Fellini and Antonioni, but they're also championing, good God, Alfred Hitchcock and Howard Hawks. It seems to me that this is a change in sensibility that the New York intellectuals just didn't get. And I wonder what the panel thinks about that.
I mean, I think it's complicated. I think there, as was said very well, and the film captured this very well, there was a kind of embrace of high culture, partly because of its distance from their Jewish roots, and the Lower East Side. I think it was a sense of the of the seriousness of what they were engaging in, that they would also engage with the most difficult literature, with Joyce, with Proust, with the most difficult art. There was really no more sort of telling insult for them than middlebrow, it's certainly when I was growing up, if I sort of gravitated towards quote middlebrow novels, no, you don't want to be reading that trash, put that away, pick up something serious like Dickens or Balzac, right? I mean, so I think that's part of it, and then what comes after the high modernism for them is too reminiscent of the 60s and the hedonism and the sort of the wildness and the lack of respect for authority, because high modernism, however challenging and rebellious it might have been in some ways, also was always had very strict standards and very strict sense of the sort of the authority of the artist. And when that came to be undermined, they rebelled. They didn't like that at all.
They were cultural conservatives.
They were cultural conservatives, very much so, yes.
The other thing I would say is that I think that, it took the 60s for popular culture to become a subject for intellectual discussion and analysis, right? Mm-hmm. And I think these guys, even as they probably began to engage in popular culture, would never have written about it in the way that the 60 generation and beyond did. I remember being really surprised when Irving Kristol told me his favorite TV show was, I don't know if you remember the sitcom Wings from the 90s. He told me he and his wife, Gertrude Himmelfarb, loved Wings. And I was, again, plotzing. And he really enjoyed it. Would he have ever written about Wings for the Wall Street Journal? I don't think so. Whereas this is, something that any intellectual might write about. I mean, the way TV is written about now, even in the Times, is kind of shocking. So I think it's a big change.
Maybe had Robert Warshall lived, I think he dies in 1955, he was one of the first ones to sort of take film seriously. Maybe he would have, I don't know, provided a little bit of a different sense, but he passed away.
There we are.